was down an embankment and her hands were bound, her feet were bound. She appeared to have ligature marks around her neck.
For over 50 years, the murder of 9-year-old Marise Ann Chiverella was one of Pennsylvania's most haunting cold cases. A crime so brutal, it scarred the quiet town of Hazleton forever.
This is a story about the cruelest of crimes, the brutal murder of a beautiful child, and how a family yearns for answers for nearly 60 years.
Now, after decades of dead ends and fading hope, modern DNA technology has finally cracked the case wide open. But as the truth emerges, it is more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The identity of her killer and the horrific details of what really happened that morning have left investigators and the community stunned. This was the nightmare no one saw coming, one that began with the shocking disappearance of an innocent child, vanished child, and a grim discovery in coal country. On the morning of March 18, 1964, 9-year-old Marise left her home on North Laurel Street in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. She was carrying a small bag of canned goods, part of a charity project for her class at St. Joseph's Parochial School. It was a cold but ordinary Wednesday. Marise was wearing a school uniform beneath her coat and a scarf around her neck. She had walked the same route before and knew it well. Her walk to school was less than 10 minutes, and her parents had no reason to expect anything unusual. But that morning, Marise never made it to school. By late morning, her absence was noticed. When the school contacted her family, confusion quickly turned into alarm. Her siblings hadn't seen her since she left the house. Her teacher confirmed she hadn't come to class. Family members began checking the route between home and school, retracing her steps, calling her name. As the hours passed, and there was still no sign of her, worry turned into panic. Police were notified, and the search widened. That same afternoon, just a few miles outside town, a man named Charles Rexkowski was giving his teenage nephew a driving lesson. They were near a coal mining area on the outskirts of Hazleton, a place filled with slag heaps, culm banks, and old waste pits. As they drove along a rural road near Hazel Township, Charles noticed something strange near a culm pile. It looked like a large doll lying awkwardly near the roadside. Curious and concerned, he stopped the car and got out to take a closer look. What he found was far worse than anything he imagined. It wasn't a doll. It was the body of a young girl. She was lying on her back, partially hidden by the terrain. Her hands and feet were tied. A cloth gag had been forced into her mouth, and she had visible injuries. The bag of canned goods she had carried was still with her. Charles quickly realized they had discovered something horrifying. It was Marise. The brutal discovery sent shockwaves through Hazleton. A child had vanished on her way to school, and now, just hours later, she was found dead, bound and gagged, in a remote and grim location. For a community that had rarely seen violent crime, especially involving children, it was an unthinkable tragedy. But no one could have guessed then that the horrifying truth about the murder would remain buried for almost 60 years, and that as the search for answers began, it would soon lead nowhere. A desperate manhunt in a town, gripped by fear. The murder of a child on her way to school lit a fire under the Pennsylvania State Police. From the start, the case was treated with urgency and determination. Troopers immediately canvassed local neighborhoods, combed through wooded areas, and questioned hundreds of local Hazleton residents. The crime scene provided a few disturbing clues. Marise's clothing had been disturbed, and her body was discovered in a shallow pit, gently but clearly concealed, as though someone had taken time to hide her, but not in a rushed or panicked way. Her wrists were tied with her own shoelaces. All signs pointed to a crime that had been planned. not something done on impulse. Whoever did this came prepared. Despite their best efforts, police found themselves hitting dead ends. It was as if Marise vanished into thin air, and only her body told part of the story. Back then, forensic technology was limited. There was no DNA testing, no surveillance cameras, no national databases. Police were working with basic tools, relying mostly on interviews, observation, and instinct. Days turned into weeks. The investigation remained intense, but there were no suspects, no arrests, and no clear motive. Eventually, the case started to cool. The trail went cold, even though everyone involved wished it wouldn't. Hazleton began to change. Fear crept in quietly and stayed. Families no longer let their kids walk to school alone. Parents drove their children door to door. Doors were locked during the day, and neighbors looked at strangers with suspicion. People were afraid, not just because of what happened, but because no one had answers. Marise's family was left in heartbreak, stuck in a world where nothing made sense. Police kept in touch, offering updates when they could. But over time, even the investigators had to admit they were out of leads. The file kept growing, but no new information came in. Just silence, pain, and more questions. Yet, Marise was never forgotten. Her photo remained in police stations, posted on bulletin boards, and reprinted in newspapers for years. Her name was spoken in whispers at school meetings, remembered at memorials, and mentioned in conversations whenever safety came up. Marise had become more than just a victim. She became a symbol of innocence, lost and justice denied. But the story didn't end there. Before the case was finally solved with modern techniques, investigators decided to revisit early theories. Old notes were pulled from boxes. Possible connections were examined again. Maybe, just maybe, something had been missed, and there was still a path that might somehow break the case open. Early theories, false leads, and a town full of questions. With no firm suspects and little evidence to guide them, detectives explored various theories, some based on similarity, others on speculation. One of the earliest and most haunting theories was the possible connection between Marise's case and the earlier murder of Carol Ann Doherty, a young girl who had been sexually assaulted and whose life had been taken about 19 months earlier in a nearby town. Both girls were young, attacked while walking alone, and their bodies showed disturbing similarities in how their private areas had been treated. Investigators saw these details as more than coincidence and considered the idea that the same person might have been responsible for both crimes. This theory led to a focused investigation, but it ultimately went nowhere. No physical evidence linked the two cases, and no suspect emerged who could be definitively tied to both. Over time, the idea of a copycat or serial offender was slowly abandoned. Another chilling possibility that faded without resolution. Another major lead centered around a young man in the area with known psychological issues. He voluntarily came forward, claiming to have seen something strange near the coal pit where Marise's body was discovered. His story was taken seriously at first. Investigators hoped he might have witnessed something crucial, but as they pressed for details, inconsistencies began to surface. His account shifted, facts didn't line up, and concerns about his mental state made it difficult to separate truth from imagination. Eventually, he was ruled out, and his statement, unsettling as it was, didn't bring the case any closer to being solved. Then there was the brown coat suspect. A man wearing a brown coat was reportedly seen in the area not far from the coal waste pit around the time Marise disappeared. The sighting triggered a targeted investigation. Police canvassed the area, questioned locals, and looked into men known to frequent that part of town. But despite efforts, no one matching the description was ever identified. The brown coat lead faded like so many others. Some detectives also floated the coal miner theory. Marise's body had been found in an abandoned coal mining waste area. Remote, grim, and known mostly to people familiar with the local mining routes. Investigators wondered if the killer could have been someone who worked in or around the mines. Coal miners, by nature of their job, had access to isolated spots like the one where Marise was found. It was a compelling angle, at least in theory. But background checks and interviews with local miners produced no promising suspects, and no direct evidence ever backed this line of thought. There were also reports of a stranger in town seen in Hazleton around the time Marise disappeared. The man was unfamiliar to locals and was described as acting suspiciously. Police followed up, hoping they had a drifter or outsider who could be connected to the murder. But that lead dried up too. The man was never identified, and no firm connection was made between him and the crime. As the months turned into years, each new tip or theory brought hope, only to end in disappointment. People reported seeing unfamiliar cars, or men behaving strangely near the school route Marise had taken that morning. But none of it added up to anything actionable. Through all of it, a growing unease settled over Hazleton. The idea that someone capable of such a violent, calculated act could remain undetected and possibly still be among them was deeply unsettling. Detectives were haunted by the fact that they had chased so many paths, only to arrive at dead ends. And the central question never changed. Who could have done this, and how had they gotten away with it? But what no one realized at the time was that the answer had been quietly preserved all along, in carefully stored evidence, waiting for the right moment and the right minds to bring it to light. A case that refused to be forgotten. As the years passed, time did what it always does. It moved on. Detectives retired. Files were boxed up and stored away. Technology changed. The people who remembered Marise as a smiling, curious little girl got older. Some passed away without ever learning who had taken her from them. Even her most hopeful family members began to quietly accept the painful possibility that justice might never come. The case, like so many others, seemed frozen in time. But something very important had happened back in 1964. Something no one could fully appreciate at the time. When Marise's body was discovered, police collected key pieces of evidence from the scene. Her clothing was carefully preserved. Biological samples were taken, and, by some stroke of foresight or luck, they were properly stored. At the time, those samples were of little use. DNA testing didn't exist yet. Science hadn't caught up to the needs of the case. Still, the evidence waited, sealed, labeled, and untouched. By the 2010s, the world of forensic science was changing fast. DNA technology had advanced beyond what anyone had imagined just decades earlier. And something even more groundbreaking was now being used to solve cold cases, a method called genetic genealogy. This process combined traditional DNA analysis with public genealogy databases, helping investigators track unknown suspects through their family trees. Suddenly, long-dormant cases all over the country were being reopened. Killers who had hidden in plain sight for decades were being found, not through fingerprints or witness statements, but through their own DNA. But the next chapter of the case wouldn't be led by detectives alone. It would involve cutting-edge science, a private lab, and an unlikely young researcher who was about to break the case wide open. The killer had left behind a trace, invisible, silent, but still there. And now, for the first time, the tools existed to follow it. Justice, once thought impossible, was finally within reach. A DNA breakthrough and the college student who cracked the code. In 2018, the Pennsylvania State Police reopened the cold case of Marise's murder and partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company known for cutting-edge DNA technology. Using the decades-old biological sample, Parabon's experts managed to create a detailed DNA profile of the unknown killer. This was a major breakthrough. For the first time, investigators had a genetic fingerprint of the man who committed the crime. In 2019, that DNA profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases such as GEDmatch, which allow people to trace their ancestry and build family trees. Investigators hope to find a match, even a distant relative, who might help identify the suspect. However, working with genetic genealogy data is not easy. It involves analyzing hundreds of potential matches, many of whom are only distantly related, and piecing together complicated family histories that span generations. To help with this task, police turned to an unexpected but promising source: an 18-year-old college student named Eric Schubert. A freshman at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, Schubert had already gained attention for solving other cold cases using genetic genealogy. Despite his young age, he had earned a reputation for being methodical, patient, and extremely thorough. In 2020, Schubert officially joined the investigation. For the next 2 years, he worked closely with law enforcement, studying the DNA matches they had received. The matches were weak, mostly third and fourth cousins, but Schubert didn't give up. He spent countless hours building out family trees, examining old census records, digging into marriage and death certificates, and following even the smallest clues. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Schubert narrowed down the family branches, eliminating people one by one, until a single name began to stand out. It was a name that had never surfaced in the original 1964 investigation. The man hadn't been a suspect, a witness, or even on the radar at the time. But something about him caught their attention. He had lived just a few blocks from where Marise had disappeared. And when investigators took a closer look into his background, what they found was deeply disturbing. The killer revealed, and the truth comes out. The name was James Paul Fort. Fort wasn't a stranger to Hazleton, Pennsylvania, nor was he someone who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Fort lived his entire life within the borders of Hazleton, blending into the community with little notice. To many, he was just another young man navigating early adulthood in a quiet, working-class town. In 1964, when Marise was murdered, Fort was 22 years old. He lived just 6 blocks away from her home, putting him easily within walking distance of her daily route to school. The two had no known connection, and no witnesses ever reported seeing them together. Fort didn't stand out, not then. He wasn't on the police's radar. There was nothing to suggest that he could be involved in such a horrific crime. To many, he was just another young man navigating early adulthood in a quiet, working-class town. People who knew him back then would later describe him as quiet, reserved, and not particularly social. He held a few different jobs over the years, including work at a local bar, and didn't seem to draw much attention. But that calm exterior masked a more troubling side, one that wouldn't fully come to light until years later. In 1974, a decade after Marise Chiverella's murder, Joseph Forte appeared in police records for the first time in connection with a violent offense. He was arrested in an unrelated case involving rape and sexual assault. Despite the seriousness of the allegations, Forte avoided prison. He reached a plea agreement with prosecutors, admitting guilt to a lesser charge, aggravated assault. This allowed him to receive a sentence of just 1 year of probation. The original rape charge was dropped as part of the plea. a common outcome at the time when victims were hesitant to testify, and legal systems often accepted lesser charges to avoid a trial. In 1978, Forte was arrested again, this time for reckless endangerment and harassment. These charges, while still serious, were considered misdemeanors under Pennsylvania law. As with his previous case, Fort did not face jail time. He either pleaded to lesser offenses, or the charges were dismissed due to lack of evidence or cooperation from witnesses. At no point during either arrest did investigators revisit the 1964 murder of Marise Chiverella. DNA technology did not exist, and there was no direct physical evidence tying Fort to the crime. Without a clear forensic link, and with Fort's name absent from the original suspect list, police never viewed him as connected to the case. His criminal record grew, but he remained undetected as Marise's killer. If he carried any guilt, he kept it buried deep. Then, in 1980, Fort's life came to an abrupt and unexpected end. He was just 38 years old when he died suddenly of a heart attack. At the time, he was working at a local bar. There was no warning, no long illness, no build-up, just a sudden and final collapse. His death shocked those who knew him. Some saw it as a tragic end for a young man, others barely took notice. After all, Forte was not a public figure. He didn't leave behind a big family or a wide circle of friends. His passing was quiet, almost unremarkable. With Fort gone, any remaining chance to question him about his past vanished. He was never named publicly as a suspect in Marise's murder. He was never brought to justice, never forced to explain the life he had led or the secrets he had kept. For decades, he lay in a cemetery in Hazleton, his crimes unknown and his name forgotten, until science gave the world a reason to dig deeper. The horrifying truth. Shortly after genealogist Eric Schubert helped investigators narrow the search to Joseph Henry Fort, authorities made a rare and decisive move. With legal permission, they exhumed Fort's remains from a cemetery in Pennsylvania. Forensic experts carefully extracted preserved tissue from his corpse, submitting it for advanced DNA analysis. The result was absolute. Fort's DNA was an exact match to the semen sample collected from Marise Chiverella's jacket in 1964. The match confirmed what no one had suspected for nearly 60 years. Marise's killer had been hiding in plain sight. On the morning of March 18, 1964, 9-year-old Marise left her Hazleton home to walk the short distance to St. Joseph's School. Along the way, she carried canned goods for a school food drive and her school books. Forte had encountered Marise on her walk to school. What followed was a devastating act. Investigators believe the crime was opportunistic, but deeply predatory in nature. Forte abducted her, restrained her with her own belongings, and sexually assaulted her. He then silenced her before leaving her alone in that desolate coal pit. A rosary she carried was still clutched in her hand. Her coat had been placed over her face, suggesting a twisted mix of shame and calculation from her killer. Authorities concluded Fort's motive was purely predatory, an act of violence against a defenseless child, carried out by a man already spiraling into deeper patterns of aggression. His later arrests for sexual assault and harassment painted the picture of a dangerous offender whose crimes escalated but went unchecked. Despite multiple run-ins with the law throughout the 1970s, Fort never served prison time. He lived out his life in the Hazleton area and died in 1980 at the age of 38, taking his secret to the grave. Or so it seemed. Now, thanks to relentless cold case efforts and forensic genealogy, the truth that eluded investigators for decades has finally been revealed. The emotional weight of the revelation shook people across the world. On social media, Where the case had been quietly followed by amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts, comments poured in. 9-year-old finally avenged, and her killer was living next door the whole time. Absolutely horrifying, one wrote. This poor girl walked out the door to go to school and never came home. He dumped her in a pit like garbage. And no one knew. No one suspected. Now we know. Now we speak for her. Another commented, she was holding her rosary. That broke me. That man lived free, had a family, while hers was destroyed forever. Disgusting, an anonymous user wrote. For the first time since that cold morning in March 1964, there was an answer. A long-awaited resolution and a lasting legacy. On February 12, 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police made a powerful announcement that closed one of the state's longest-running cold cases. They officially named James Paul Fort as the man responsible for the 1964 murder of 9-year-old Marise Chiverella. It was a moment that brought both relief and sorrow. For the Chiverella family, it marked the end of a painful chapter filled with questions and uncertainty. Marise's siblings, now much older with children and grandchildren of their own, had carried the weight of her loss for most of their lives. They feared they would never learn what really happened. So when the police shared the news, it brought an emotional release. Sadness for what was lost, but also peace in finally knowing. They expressed deep gratitude to everyone involved in the investigation, the dedicated officers, forensic experts, and especially Eric Schubert, who played a key role in helping to solve the case. Back in Hazleton, the small Pennsylvania town where Marise lived, the announcement sent waves through the community. Back in 1964, her murder had shocked and unsettled everyone. It had changed the way people lived. Parents became more protective. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. For years, fear and suspicion lingered. Many wondered if the killer had stayed in town, walking among them. Rumors and theories passed from one generation to the next. The case became a shadow that hovered over Hazleton for decades. But when police revealed Fort's identity, something shifted. There was a collective sigh of relief. People who had lived with the mystery for years finally had closure.
Now that we know the individual, it gives us a sense of closure. Not full closure, we'll never have that, but a sense of closure that we know the individual that did it.
The unknown had a name. The fear lost its power. It was a turning point, not just for the Chiverella family, but for an entire community that had carried this loss for so long. More than anything, the case showed the power of persistence and technology working together. Investigative genetic genealogy, a new and powerful tool, helped solve a crime that once seemed unsolvable. It proved that no matter how much time passes, justice can still be served. It gave hope to other families still waiting for answers. Marise Chiverella was only 9 years old when her life was taken. She never got the chance to grow up, to follow her dreams, or to have a voice. But, in a way, the solving of her case gave her voice back. Her story was not forgotten. Her name was not lost in time. And now, she has become a symbol of what can happen when people refuse to give up. Her memory lives on not just in her family, but in a town, a state, and a country that still believes the truth matters, no matter how long it takes to find. What do you think about Marise's case? Feel free to share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Want more videos like this? Then subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening stories. Thank you so much for staying with us till the end. See you in the next video.